For over a decade, one company convinced hundreds of thousands of Americans that a diploma from one of its campuses would change their life. It promised real careers, real job placement, real futures. Almost none of it was true. By the time it collapsed, it had taken over $1 billion in student loans with it, and left tens of thousands of students holding worthless degrees and crushing debt. This is the story of Corinthian Colleges. Corinthian Colleges was, at its peak, the second largest for-profit college chain in the United States. It ran over 100 campuses under names like Everest, Heald, and Wyotech, promising career training in fields like healthcare, criminal justice, and business. But Corinthian didn't market itself evenly to everyone. Its recruiting was aimed squarely at people who needed a second chance more than anyone. Single parents trying to build a stable career, veterans using their GI Bill benefits, and first-generation students with no one in their family who'd been through college before to warn them what to look for. Internal sales scripts, later revealed in lawsuits, describe the ideal Corinthian student in blunt terms: isolated, with low self-esteem, and looking for someone to give them direction. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the strategy. Corinthian's pitch was simple and powerful. Enroll here and we'll get you a job. Their advertising leaned hard on one number in particular: job placement rates, that made their program sound like a guaranteed path to a better life. That number is where this story really starts to fall apart, because in reality, at some Corinthian campuses, actual job placement rates were closer to 45%. Investigations later revealed something worse than just an exaggerated number. Some employees allegedly counted graduates as employed in their field for jobs that had nothing to do with what they'd studied: a fast food job, a temp gig, anything to keep the number looking good enough to keep enrollment and federal student loan dollars flowing in. One former student, a single mother who enrolled in a medical assistant program, hoping for stable work to support her kids, later described graduating over $30,000 in debt with a credential that local hospitals and clinics wouldn't even recognize. She isn't an isolated case. She's one of tens of thousands with a nearly identical story. And that's really the engine underneath this whole system: federal student aid. Corinthian, like most for-profit colleges, depended heavily on students taking out federal loans to pay tuition. More enrolled students meant more loan money flowing into the company, regardless of whether those students ever finished a program or found a job afterward. The incentive wasn't to help students succeed, it was to get the NM enrolled. By the early 2000s, regulators and journalists started digging in seriously. California's Attorney General filed suit against Corinthian, alleging false advertising and predatory lending practices. Other states, including Massachusetts and Wisconsin, opened their own investigations. Journalists began publishing accounts from former students describing recruiting tactics that felt less like admissions and more like a sales pitch on vulnerable people. California's investigation turned up internal emails and training materials that painted a damning picture. Recruiters were coached on overcoming objections, the same way a used car salesman might be trained, not the way an academic advisor would guide someone through a real education decision. Former admissions employees later came forward as whistleblowers, describing quotas they were expected to hit regardless of whether a prospective student was actually a good fit. The federal government began scrutinizing Corinthian's marketing claims and its financial reliance on student aid. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Education restricted Corinthian's access to federal student aid funds while it investigated the company's data, a move that hit Corinthian exactly where it depended most. Without that funding pipeline, Corinthian couldn't survive. Campuses began closing or being sold off in a matter of weeks. And in 2015, the company filed for bankruptcy. But the real damage wasn't to the company, it was to the students. Tens of thousands of former Corinthian students were left with degrees that employers didn't respect, debt they couldn't easily discharge, and for many, no real career gain to show for it. The scale of the harm was significant enough that the government eventually stepped in with debt relief for defrauded students. In 2015, Corinthian agreed to a settlement north of $200 million over deceptive practices. And what happened to the people who ran the company? Corinthian's executives largely walked away financially intact. No criminal charges were ever filed against the company's top leadership. For a lot of former students, that's the hardest part of the story. The people who built a business model on their vulnerability faced a settlement number, while the students faced years of debt and a credential that couldn't get them the job they were promised. Even the debt relief process wasn't simple. Former students had to formally prove their specific program had misled them, a bureaucratic process that took years to resolve for many. Corinthian Colleges wasn't an isolated case either. In the years that followed, other for-profit college chains, ITT Tech, Education Corporation of America, collapsed under strikingly similar circumstances. Inflated outcomes, aggressive recruiting of vulnerable students, heavy reliance on federal student aid, and a sudden collapse that left students scrambling. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this pattern has happened before, and it happened again after Corinthian, why does it keep happening? And who's supposed to be catching it before students pay the price? That question is actually where the next part of the story goes. Because there's one organization that approved nearly every one of these schools before they collapsed, and almost nobody's ever heard of it. If you want to see how deep this pattern really goes, subscribe. That story's coming next.